deal was the final offer. The Prime Minister's confirmed millions of public sector workers will get similar increases, like teachers who've ended their walkouts. Junior medics have begun 5 days of industrial action today. Donna Hales is an NHS nurse who voted to reject the previous pay offer made to the RCN and told LBC the cost of living isn't getting easier.
Rishi Sunak did say earlier on in the year that inflation would be back down to 6% by June. And that was his aim. That was the aim of the government. And obviously, clearly, that hasn't happened. On top of that now, we've also got hikes on interest rates for mortgages. That's going to affect businesses and things as well.
2 17-year-old boys have been jailed for at least 34 years between them for killing a teenager in Wolverhampton. 16-year-old Ronan Kenda was attacked in a case of mistaken identity in June last year as he walked home from a friend's house. One of the boys had bought a ninja sword and machete online before the attack. A report has warned the UK has failed to develop an effective strategy for dealing with national security threats from China. Parliament's Intelligence and Security Committee says it's allowed the country's intelligence to aggressively target Britain. It's accused the government of failing to recognise the issues involved, but Rishi Sunak says the government has taken measures. Police in Manchester are investigating reports of malicious messages being sent to schools in the city. They say they don't feel there's any credible threat, but are making a robust investigation. The London premiere of the film Oppenheimer was moved forward an hour tonight so it wouldn't clash with a strike. Hollywood actors are joining writers for the action for the first time since the 1960s after their deadline to reach a deal with the union and studios passed. Actors want higher pay and safeguards against using their images through artificial intelligence. Speaking at the premiere, Matt Damon told LBC this evening he backs the action.
We voted 98% to 2% to authorize a strike because we want our leadership to have that leverage if they need it. If they call it, they're saying they need it, and we believe that.
In the city, the FTSE 100 has closed up 24 points at 74.40. The pound buys $1.30 and €1.16. LBC weather: showers across Northern Ireland, southern Scotland and northwest England tonight. Heavy rain in the southwest by the early hours and a low of 8 degrees. From Global's newsroom for LBC, I'm Daryl Jackson.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation with Iain Dale.
Hello, a very good evening. It's 3 minutes past 8 on LBC. It's Iain Dale here with you until 10. Well, as you know, on a Thursday evening, we like to have one guest in the studio. I talk to them for half an hour and then we take some calls as well. And today, we've got someone who has written a book, which is not unusual, called One Boy, Two Bills and a Fry-Up, a memoir of growing up and getting on. And there's this cherubic little face on the front cover, and it is that of Wes Streeting, Shadow Health Secretary, MP for Ilford North. And on the back, there's one as he is now. I think we'll just stick with the front cover, Wes. You can watch us. If you are watching us, you can see me hold up the front cover of the book on Global Player. It's quite unusual for someone to write a memoir, which is what this is, at a comparatively young age. What drove you to do it?
Well, that's why I said no originally. So this book wasn't actually my idea. As you know, I was off a couple of years ago going through treatment for kidney cancer. And when I came back, I did an interview with Rachel Sylvester at the Times newspaper, which was really meant to be focused on the experience I've been through, and I'd just been given a new job by Keir Starmer as Shadow Child Poverty Minister, so it's going to be all about that, really. And obviously, Rachel asked the obvious questions around, my background and motivation around child poverty. And as I said more and more, and she was scribbling more and more, and she was asking more and more questions, I was opening up more and more. And so she produced this interview, which probably for the first time in my life actually revealed things about my childhood and growing up that I'd never told even people that were good friends of mine for many years. And lots of people who I went to university with, even people I went to school with, had seen that interview and said I had no idea. And I got a little note in the post from Tom Perrin at Hodder, the publisher who went on to become my editor, saying, amazing story, this will make a great book, have you ever considered writing one? Here's my number, get in touch. So I rang him and basically to say, I'm really flattered and thank you so much, but this is not the sort of thing you tend to do at my age as a politician. It tends to be something you do at the end of your career, and I really hope this book is not career-ending. And there was also another big anxiety, which was I've shared things in this book which, by virtue of not having told people who've been my friends for years, are things that I've been uncomfortable talking about and sharing. So it's one thing sharing them with friends. It's something else to share them with, the country, assuming that millions and millions of people are going out to buy the book.
You just told me it's on the Sunday Times bestseller list.
Well, I wasn't going to mention that, Iain, because I'm humble, but thank you very much for mentioning it.
But knowing you, Wes, I know you would have done at some point during the hour.
I would have told you off and said, I can't believe I've not mentioned this, as I did outside. I think... my genuine anxiety, though, was opening up to the extent that I have. And I spoke to my parents about it, and they were supportive. And without their support, I would not have written it. I spoke to people I work with and trust, Jess Phillips and Michael Cashman, politicians who've written brilliant books, by the way. They were like, you've got to do it. I spoke, crucially, I spoke to Kieran and his team, and they were supportive. And going back to, I promise not to waffle on like this in answer to all your questions, but going back to your fundamental question, why now? I think had it not been for the cancer experience, I probably would have stuck to my guns and said no. And it's not that I'm frightened of dying, because my operation was successful, my prognosis is excellent. I never feared dying during the course of my cancer experience. It was more a different feeling of, you never know what's around the corner. You never know what life holds for you. You've got to seize the moment, and who knows, by the time I've finished my career in politics, whenever that is, and I might knock on the door of a publisher and say, well, I've got some story to tell now, but like, who are you? Old news, off you go. So it's a labour of love. It's very personal rather than political, and I'm very glad it's been as well received as it has been.
My challenge this hour is not to ask the same questions that you've been asked in all the other interviews that you've done, because you've done...
Yeah, you're on my danger zone list, by the way, because you've been tweeting at me the bits of the book that have made you cry, and they're the bits of the book that make me cry. So I've managed to get through this process of talking about the book without crying. Although actually Christian Guru Murthy, he broke me on the dog story, which we might come on to.
Yeah.
And I started to well up, and you can see it if you look on our interview on YouTube. But I'm trying to keep my kind of stiff upper lip.
I mean, the thing about this book, and I don't know whether I've read it differently because I know you a bit, or whether I would sort of react the same if I didn't know you. I don't know the answer to that question, but it is incredibly personal.
Yeah.
I'm sure there are things that you've left out because you wouldn't want to sort of hurt somebody, but I mean, it's searingly honest at times.
Yeah.
And I mean, I vaguely knew a bit about your background, but I suspect even some of your closest friends, certainly in politics, would have had no idea of the kind of life that you've had.
No, that is true. And the best feedback I've had so far has been from people who've read the book, who come from a similar background, who said this really spoke to me, or I went through something similar. And because I'm a politician and my email address is on the Parliament website, I'm much more accessible than lots of authors are. So I've had lots of feedback from people, and those are the best bits of feedback, because that's really who the book was written for. It's not. As you say, it's not a classic politician's memoir, so it's not really written for the Westminster bubble, for the political editors, for the usual suspects. It's a book fundamentally about class, growing up, not just working class, but poor working class. But it's not a misery memoir. Oh God, no!
Because I think
I'd be disappointed if people read it and felt miserable.
But I think it's actually a really inspirational book where people who might be, I don't know, living sort of, I don't know about similar lives, but maybe are living difficult lives in other parts of the country, they'll be able to relate to this. And I think you've got this sort of, the idea that you broke through the ceiling. Because you're constantly talking about, I've got to get out of this.
Yeah.
And even at the age of 6 or 7, you kind of had that aspiration. But I wonder, even in 2023... I mean, whether it was different in 1933 or 1963, I don't know. But this whole idea of improving yourself, bettering yourself, and your parents wanting you to do that and giving you the support to do that, I mean, that was actually, I thought, one of the main lessons from the book, that your both of your parents, who, I mean, they split up very early on.
Yeah.
But they were and are still integral to your life and provided you with that inspiration, even though they didn't have two pennies to rub together. Certainly your mother didn't.
Yeah, that's right. And if there's one term in sort of general political discourse that drives me potty, it's middle-class aspiration. I hate this idea that aspiration belongs to the middle classes, and that if only working class families were more ambitious, more aspirational, it would all be okay. Like, where we are very ambitious and aspirational. What's lacking isn't ambition, it's opportunity, and often the security in life that gives you the chance to take advantage of those opportunities. I mean, just before I came here, I was talking to a group of aspiring journalists at a media organisation I won't mention. I don't think they're a rival to LBC or Global particularly, but another media organisation, and they're running this programme for aspiring journalists, and they give them a week of proper intensive training and opportunities, but funded with accommodation in London. And the reason why I chose to give up an hour of my time to go and do it, there's no particular return for me on the investment of that time, was because I thought, this is a brilliant scheme. There are going to be people there who would not have had the opportunity to do this had it not been funded, to come to London and experience some real media experience. And so those are the sorts of ladders you have to extend for people to kind of achieve their ambition. And whether that's through apprenticeships or university, I mean, I had a great state education. It's one of the reasons I'm here now. It's not the talent or the ambition that's lacking, it's the opportunity and the security.
You were born in 1982?
83.
83.
I should quiz you on this book, actually.
Well, I wasn't far off. But I wasn't even thinking about this while I was reading the book. But I lived in the East End from 1988 and through to 1997, so your sort of formative years.
Wow,
I didn't live very far, certainly in the 1990s. I lived on the Isle of Dogs, so not very far from where you were growing up in Wapping or Stepney. But I was living in a Docklands sort of...
Yeah, you lived in the posh bit. You were on the Yuppies.
I lived in Cascade. Do you know that building? At the top of the Isle of Dogs, the sort of wedge-shaped one that's right on the river.
God, we didn't go down to the Isle of Dogs. I mean, that was rough even compared to Stepney, apart from the posh bits you lived in, so Exactly. It wouldn't be allowed down there.
But I was thinking, I lived like literally a mile or 2 miles from where you were growing up. Yeah, I would never have encountered somebody like you.
That is the remarkable thing about the London Borough of Tower Hamlets and the East End that I grew up in, because I could go to the top of my block of flats where I lived in Stepney, and I could look in one direction and see the BT Tower and, you know, the peaks of the City of London, the Square Mile. I could look the other way out towards the Docklands, and these are two of the richest places on earth with incredible opportunities and wealth. And then in between, you've got the East End, which then had some of the highest child poverty levels in Britain, today still has some of the highest child poverty levels in Britain. And so, especially when I went to secondary school in central London, because my brilliant head teacher wanted to help me escape Tower Hamlets. I mean, London's state schools back in the 80s and 90s had a terrible reputation, and Tower Hamlets had one of the worst reputations a lot. So my brilliant primary school head teacher, Mrs. Dodd, as she was then, Mrs. Howarth as she is now, she put me on a tube to Victoria to go to this school called Westminster City, which it's actually doing really well today. But when I went there, it was in special measures. And lots of people confuse it with the Westminster School. I went to this school
That's one Nick Clegg went to.
Yeah, the one Nick Clegg, and all the rest of them. That's why, you know, it's got lots to answer for, that school. But my school up the road, I probably can't say what his nickname was because of Ofcom rules, and I don't know whether I'm allowed to say the word that rhymes with city on air, but that's what they used to call it. And, you know, one of the things I'll never forget is getting off the tube in the middle of London, and I saw the London that I now work in, a London that lots of people associate and conjure up images of London. You know, the bustling commuters, Big Ben, the Houses of Parliament, these big shops, and that wasn't my London. My London was the streets of Stepney and Bow and Wapping, where my extended East End family lives. And so it's amazing, even in this city that is full of opportunities and wealth and excitement, there are lots of people who, growing up in the city today, do not see that version of London. They live a different London. This is a sort of genuinely a tale of two cities.
And of course, even parts of the East End are not like when you grew up there in the 80s and 90s now. If you look at sort of Dalston, for example, if you look at Shoreditch...
I mean, honestly, we used to look
down... It's not like it was in the 80s or 90s.
We used to look down our nose at Hackney.
Yeah.
Like, we lived in Stepney in a pretty awful council flat, as I describe in the book, and we had all sorts of issues with, the electric meter running out and the lights going off. We had issues with cockroaches from next door. One of the flats we lived in, we had fleas, and...
that was a page where I kept grimacing.
Yeah, well, imagine how I felt seeing them and being bitten. But we used to. I remember my mum saying, "Well, at least we don't live in Hackney." And now I couldn't afford to live in Hackney, even on my salary. And actually, my nan, my mum's mum, she was a real campaigner against the gentrification. She was part of the Joint Docklands Action Group that sort of took on the regeneration and the displacement of lots of working class East End communities. But it's a different place now.
Part of the book, I mean, let's actually look at the title, but a lot of the book is about your grandparents.
Yeah.
Great-grandparents. And it's a fascinating family history as well. And I think you would give anything. Here's where you're going to tear up.
No, don't. I feel it.
You would give everything for your grandparents to see what you've done, just as I would mine. I only knew one of my grandparents.
You're a horrible person. You're going to break me live on air. Yes, that's the real sadness as I was writing the book, because I really wanted to do them justice. They're very different. I mean, the two bills in the title were my two granddads. One was Bill Crowley, my mum's dad, in and out of prison with a string of convictions for armed robbery throughout my mum's childhood, my childhood. He
were you aware of all of that when you were quite young?
Yeah, I mean, I went to see him in prison when I was in primary school, and I didn't like it. I didn't want to go back. And it was so bad. I mean, my mum wasn't literally born in prison. She was born up the road at the Whittington Hospital in Islington. But my nan was in Holloway Prison on account of my granddad's criminal activity. And so my nan was pregnant in prison, and interestingly shared a cell with Christine Keeler, who's at the heart of the Parfum Over, and they became lifelong friends. And in fact, my nan, I'm determined to spend some time over the summer actually looking through some old Getty Images archives of Christine Keeler, because Christine lent my nan some of her clothes because they looked fairly similar. And similar frame, similar build, similar hair colour. So Christine gave my nan some of her clothes to act as a decoy sometimes for the paparazzi. So there are probably some photos of my nan tagged Christine Keeler on some of these websites. But, he was a complicated character, to put it mildly. It wasn't until much later in his life that he opened up about the abuse he suffered at the hands of his father, physical abuse, sexual abuse. And suddenly everything made sense because, my granddad Pops, he was a kind man, a funny man, a clever man, and yet had done these terrible things. And I couldn't reconcile these two characters. And when I learned about his childhood, it suddenly made sense.
Did you talk to him about it?
No, he talked to my mum about it, and over. In terms of his criminal life, no, I really wish I had. The stories in the book about some of the things he got up to, those are my mum's recollections, and it's complicated because there was one job he did where he'd gone in. I think it was a shop or a post office, and he sort of held a shotgun up in the woman's face behind the counter. And she went to reach for the kind of panic button, and he said, "If you press that, I'll shoot you." And she just looked him dead in the eye and said, "Go on then, and press the button." And of course he wasn't going to shoot her. So he burst into fits of laughter, ran out, ran home, and when he arrived home, he was still in fits of laughter. And he walked through the door, Mum was saying, "What's going on, Dad?" And he was going, "Only a woman, only a woman." And she's like, "What do you mean? What do you mean?" He said, "Only a woman could have done that. Only a woman." He found it funny. And my mum was telling me this story, and I said, "But when you tell it in that way, you could almost see the comedy of the situation." But I bet she didn't go home laughing.
No.
And I don't know what impact that would have, because that would have scared the living daylights out of me.
The other interesting thing about that is that he went home and told his wife about it, whereas I think a lot of criminals of that sort of genre would try and keep their criminal activity away from their family.
Yeah, and he told my mum, and my mum said to him, like, "But what about, do you think about the people, the people that are affected?" And he said, "Oh no, they lead really boring lives, so I've given them something to talk about." So yeah, he was, and then there's my other granddad, which actually there's a granddad.
Actually, we'll come on to your other granddad in a minute, because I've just looked at the time and we're
prattling on.
We're prattling on. Well, I am, don't know about you. But somebody's asking, is the book going to be available as an audiobook? It is, and Wes reads it himself, so there you go. We'll come to more on the book, One Boy, Two Bills and a Fry-Up in just a few moments' time with Wes Streeting. It's 21 minutes past 8.
This is LBC. Leading Britain's conversation. Iain Dale. Tweet at LBC.
8:23 on LBC. Wes Streeting is with us talking about his book, One Boy, Two Bills and a Fry-Up. Now, we were getting on to your other granddad.
Yeah, my other granddad, the one that no one focuses on because he didn't rob banks and post offices.
No, but he had a massive impact on your life.
Oh, he did. He was a very different Bill. This is my dad's dad, Bill Streeting. He led a very different life. He came from a very nuclear East End family, but a family that worked hard, played by the rules, and instilled that work ethic in every generation. And certainly my work ethic very much comes from my dad and my granddad. He was served in the Royal Navy during the Second World War, was civil engineer throughout his career, and as well as being a Christian and influential in terms of my own faith, he was what I would call a pull yourself up by your bootstraps, working class Thatcherite Tory. And in fact, the only time he didn't vote Tory was Liberal to quote unquote keep Labour out in Tower Hamlets. That's how much of a Tory he was. And despite...
So when I said he had a big influence on you, not that big.
No, he did. Well, actually, loads of my critics on the left would say, "That explains it." Bloody Tory. But No, he was the most influential and important person in my life, and I can say that confidently, knowing that my mum and dad have long since accepted that I loved my granddad more than anyone else in the whole wide world. The love and support I had from my granddad was incredible. He was a rock of stability throughout my childhood growing up, when things were a bit turbulent at home with my mum, particularly when her mum, my nanny Libby, died. I went to live with my granddad for a period, and ironically, it was, despite being my first experience of losing a family member, at least to, through death, when I just felt wrapped up in this ball of cotton wool by my granddad, and some of those weeks and months that I spent with him were the happiest of my life, actually, living with him. And he was just so devoted to me as a grandfather. It really supported me in terms of my reading, my education. He indulged me so much. We talk about spoil. I mean, he indulged really weird requests. Like on a Saturday morning, if I wanted bird's eye beef burgers and potato waffles for breakfast, he would make them for me. It was that level of like, I'll do anything you want as my grandson. And he'd sit and watch the same films with me over and over again. He was just the most incredible person. And certainly the hardest bit of the book to write, and definitely the hardest bit to read on the audiobook for those of you who choose to listen, where you sort of managed to just about contain myself, was losing him a year after I lost my nanny Libby, my mum's mum. He died a year later, and it's 30 years on, it is still the worst thing that's ever happened to me in my entire life.
You had a lot of different homes, from sort of when you were born until you left home. But it was sort of normal for you, I suppose, in a sense, because I lived in the same house from the day I was born till the day I went to university. I don't know how many different homes you had, and none of them, and they were full of love, I think. That is quite clear from the book. But you talk about the sort of sparse furnishings. Certainly, I remember one of the flats for years had no carpet in it.
Yeah.
Because there was no money around, literally no money. And when you were at school, did that ever get you down, where you saw other kids who had, your best friend Luke, for example, came from a much better off family in terms of money. Did that ever really get you down?
It did, but only in the sense that, I was just conscious that we were poorer, and so it was small things like he was my best friend throughout primary school and secondary school, and we were inseparable, and his parents used to invite me round to play, and I used to think they were really posh. His dad was a taxi driver and did some professional photography on the side. His mum worked for an estate agent, I think, for a time. So it's not like they were the Rees-Moggs or, aristocracy. They were middle-class people who had a, good standard of living, but it was a world away from where I lived. And I never resented my best friend for that. And in fact, I always felt so welcome in their home, and it was of such an important friendship for me in lots of ways, but I never felt able to reciprocate. I always felt ashamed of where we lived, and I never had friends around to play because I thought I didn't want people to see where we lived and the conditions that we were living with, and that was hard. And when I went to secondary school, because of the way they did the free school meal system, the first day I sort of went in, I had this big queue for school dinners to get into the school hall, walked through the door, and then realised I had to join the queue to get my dinner ticket to exchange for my school meal. And I felt like I might as well have been standing under a massive flashing neon light saying, "This is the poor kids' queue." So I felt that stigma then. And there is a sort of stigma, I think, attached to poverty sometimes. It's one of the reasons why it took me years to open up about my upbringing and my childhood and what we went through, because as you say, it was a happy childhood in so many respects, and my parents made lots of sacrifices for me, but it wasn't always easy, and it was hard seeing my mum struggle to the extent that she did, even with the support my dad gave her through child maintenance and the support she got through the benefit system and the support she got from working in casual jobs.
Have you poshed up your voice?
Yes, you can still hear my East End twang, but my accent has changed over the years and has professionalised. And that was partly...
Deliberately?
Well, yes and no. I mean, my granddad, my dad's dad, brought me up to speak properly and said it was really important. Also, I had an English teacher at secondary school in my second year who basically said how you look and how you sound is going to affect your future. And I reflect on this a bit in the book. I feel quite conflicted about that advice. I don't think people should have to change how they sound or how they look in order to get on. But that was good advice, because unfortunately people do judge on appearances and how you sound. I think that's changed a lot over the years. But, you know, you talk to Chris Mason, the BBC political editor, about how having a Yorkshire accent has affected his thinking and his career. I mean, actually, he's landed very well, actually, in that big job, but it's not been plain sailing. Or you talk to Beth Rigby on Sky News, who constantly gets picked up on social media because she drops her G's at the end of her sentence. I think there is still a sort of snobbery and class discrimination in this country. It's not maybe as bad as it was, but it still exists.
My mother said to me once that I should hyphenate my surname because my middle name's Campbell, and she said, if you hyphenate your surname, you'll get on in life.
Iain Campbell Dale.
Yeah, bit posh, isn't it?
Very posh.
And I said, absolutely not, no way. But looking back, I think she had a point. I'm not saying that it would have made any difference at all, but I think, given that...
It wouldn't work for the LBC jingle, would it?
Wouldn't really.
Iain Campbell Dale.
No, but I think in the 80s, I never really was aware of class, which I know sounds a bit odd, but I am now. I think the whole class thing in society has become much more entrenched.
I am on such good behaviour. When you said I've never been conscious of class, I was going to say, well, some people say you've never had any class, Ian, but I've been on such good behaviour this evening. I'm not in the...
Time for the news headlines. It's 8:32. Here's Daryl Jackson.
NHS doctors in England say they'll continue with strike action despite Rishi Sunak saying a 6% pay deal was the final offer. The government's confirmed millions of public workers will receive similar increases, including teachers who've ended their own industrial action. 2 teenagers have been locked up for a total of 34 years for murdering a 16-year-old who was stabbed with a ninja sword. Ronan Kanda was attacked in a street in Wolverhampton last year as he walked home from a friend's house. And American actors will be joining writers on picket lines after members of the US Acting Guild voted to take strike action. The decision to walk out means that for the first time in 63 years, actors and writers will strike at the same time. LBC weather: showers across Northern Ireland, southern Scotland and northwest England tonight. Heavy rain in the southwest by the early hours and a low of 8 degrees.
This is LBC. Leading Britain's conversation. Iain Dale. Alexa, send a comment to LBC.
8:35, we're talking to Wes Streeting, Labour MP, Shadow Health Secretary, who's author of the new book, One Boy, Two Bills, and, the new Sunday Times best-selling book, One Boy, Two Bills, and a Fry-Up. You talk about your sexuality in the book, and you had quite a few conflicts on that, particularly with your religion. And you really, I think, well, correct me if I'm wrong, but I interpreted this that you weren't really aware of sexuality at a very early age. And when you were, you sort of kept it hidden to yourself to an extent.
Yeah, I can't remember when I first realised I was gay, but I do remember trying desperately hard not to be gay for lots of reasons. It was, bearing in mind I was at secondary school, an inner city all-boys school in the 1990s. Section 28, the law that prescribed any discussion of homosexuality as quote-unquote pretended family relationships, that was in full force, and the consequence of it was lots of schools felt ill-equipped or unable to tackle homophobic bullying, which I experienced when I was at school. And I had all these fears and anxieties that I think lots of people had, and I think even today still have. Am I going to be discriminated against? Is my life going to be harder? How will my parents react? And then in terms of my own faith...
Well, just before we get onto that, you relate an incident at your secondary school where you thought you ought to be made head boy. Have I got that right? And
yeah.
Then you overheard, or a teacher told you
Basically,
something.
I was told by an openly gay teacher at the school that the reason I hadn't been given the job was because one of the teachers involved in making the decision had said in the staff room that I wouldn't make a good role model for younger pupils because I was gay. And I wasn't out at the time. I hadn't even admitted to myself that I was gay, let alone anyone else. I think I'd stood out throughout my time at secondary school for being different, not least for being, one of the drama group that was... A, first of all, in the drama group, and B, being the one who, in an all-boys school, offered to put on the flowery dress and a grey wig and black high heels and a Mrs. Thatcher handbag to Ernie's incredible hallucinations.
The clues were there.
Honest. I played Ernie's mum in year 8, so I must have been, 12, 13. No wonder I've got skin like a rhinoceros now and able to take on Twitter trolls, because it's nothing compared to the abuse doled out in an all-boys school playing a woman with a grey wig. Although, having said that, actually, even some of my tormentors gave me credit for guts for doing that. But going back to this point, it confirmed, the teacher in question, I confronted her and she denied it. But even
Which is quite a ballsy thing to do.
Well, I just thought, I'm not having this. One of my traits, I'm not backwards in coming forwards, so I thought, right, I'm going to have it out with her. And she denied it, but I thought just the mere possibility of this tells me that my worst fears are true. And that was before contending with, can I be gay and Christian, and what does this mean? So I buried myself back in the closet so far. I might as well been talking to Aslan in Narnia. I was that far back in the wardrobe by that point.
I got the impression, and again, I may have misinterpreted it, I got the impression that in the various bits in the book, when you're talking about your sexuality, you can't wait to get onto the next bit. Do you know what I mean?
Oh, that's interesting. Is that true? That might just be the brutal editing process where those ruthless
it could be, but I just got the feeling that
130,000 beautiful words.
It's still something that you have to talk about because you're a public figure and you are a role model, and so you do have to talk about it. But in many ways, you'd rather not.
I think that's true. That is true to an extent. That is true to an extent. It's definitely not a bonk buster if that's what people
disappointing on that front. I can tell you,
people want to buy, and it's not a kiss and tell all. But yeah, I think. In fact, I was thinking about this earlier when I was doing another programme, and I was talking about. A period, I'd forgotten about this, and I don't think it made the cut in the book, but I remember going to GAY at the Astoria when I was in sixth form. I went with my best friend Luke, who at this point had gone off to the Brit School for Performing Arts, and he was out at secondary school and very much out there. And there was a bunch of us who went, some of whom were gay, some of whom were straight. It was my first time in a gay club, and I just remember being like fascinated by the whole thing, and was still on best behaviour, still very much kind of held back in the closet. But yeah, I think that was part of the kind of I definitely fit in with these people.
When did the political bug first bite? Because some of your family were quite political.
Yeah.
Your grandmother certainly was. She was in the
Nanny Libby was
whopping
really
picket line, wasn't she?
Oh, I mean, honestly, I've had some predictable stick for going to the Murdoch summer party recently with other politicians. She'd have been horrified, by the way. And she was picketing the News International site at Wapping. She was very much a activist campaigner, fought for the tenants' rights. She was part of the joint Docklands Action Group against the development of London's Docklands, very active in the Labour Party, could have been a great Labour councillor. The local Labour Party wanted her to be, but she was too ashamed of her criminal record. So I've definitely got some of that political blood running through my veins, and I've definitely get a lot of my social conscience from my nan and from my mum. I think from my dad and my granddad, both of whom were sort of working class Tories, I've some influence in terms of values, particularly patriotism, love for king and country, respect for the law. I think more than that, though, an understanding about why people vote Conservative, including working class people, which I think has served me well.
Why do you think it is, though, that so few Labour politicians would say what you've just said about king and country and all the rest of it?
Well, I think we would now. And I point people back to a very strong, proud, patriotic tradition on the left. Look at Attlee's government. I mean, these are people who had served in the army in various capacities throughout their lives, served alongside Winston Churchill in the wartime cabinet. In fact, Attlee and the Labour Party were absolutely pivotal to Winston Churchill being made leader of the Conservative Party, rather than the aristocrat up the corridor in the House of Lords. We're a party that founded NATO. We are a party that have, I think, justice written through our political DNA, but that's not always been the perception, and actually sometimes not always been the perception because of our own actions or some of our own leading figures. But I don't think there's any and what really bugs me is when I talk about these sorts of issues, there'll be some people on the left who are like, and especially, the Labour Party puts, under Keir's leadership, the Labour Party proudly puts our country's flag on our leaflets. And there are people who are like, why are they doing that? Oh, it's like, why should we surrender our country's national flag to people on the right of British politics, let alone the far right? Remember, the far right British National Party used to stamp the flag on. And I remember saying to my dad, we talk about this a lot, why are mainstream politicians surrendering our country's flag that belongs to all of us to this fringe far right group of racists? That's not what our flag stands for. So I very much believe in like reclaiming it forever. It doesn't belong to the Labour Party. It doesn't belong to the Conservative Party. It belongs to all of us. And that's my sort of politics, really. And some of that I get through my dad and my granddad. But the political, look, this is not the politically correct answer, is it? The truth is I was interested in politics at a young age. And there'll be some people like, oh, God, he's one of those dreadful people. But I actually think it's a really good thing when young people take an interest in politics and issues. I actively encourage kids in my constituency and others to take an interest. I want them to care about the world they're growing up in. Obviously, I'd like them to grow up, sharing my politics, but that's not the advice I give them, actually. I'd say, look, wherever you stand, whoever you'd support, whichever party you would vote for, get involved, make your voice heard. I think it's a good thing. So I have no shame whatsoever about taking an interest in politics, or indeed being one of the only unsuccessful Labour candidates on the 1st of May 1997, where I proudly put myself forward as the school mock election candidate, and I stood up in Assembly and I told them what Tony Blair was going to deliver, you know, in terms of increased investment in state education and even homework clubs at Premier League football grounds, which, by the way, we delivered. But I still came second to the monster raving loony party.
It's an achievement of sorts.
A respectable second.
You mentioned going to Murdoch's party earlier. Simon wants to know, why did you go?
Because I think it's really important that we speak to all audiences, that we speak to Sun readers and Times readers just as much we speak to Guardian readers and Mirror readers. I think it's important that we build relationships with journalists from across the political spectrum so they understand our values and what motivates us, and they understand what our agenda is, and we try and get a fairer hearing. I'm not under any illusions about this, by the way. Just because, you know, we talk to people at, you know, the Sun, the Times or the Mail, or, you know, it doesn't mean that they're going to give us favourable editorials all the time. Quite the opposite. They don't always, in some cases, don't often agree with us. But I don't understand this view that says, right, when, you know, we're going to shut you off and we're not going to talk to you. There are some exceptions, of course. I mean, I totally understand why, and would never challenge or disagree with either my colleagues from Merseyside or the people of Liverpool, for example, who boycotted the Sun newspaper for many years because of its appalling coverage of the Hillsborough disaster. I totally respect that, really do. From the bottom of my heart, I respect that. As an elected politician, though, I want to make sure that people hear Labour's message from Labour rather than filtered. You know, when GB News was set up, I didn't imagine it was being set up as a Labour-supporting TV station. But, you know, I will go on and talk to GB News viewers.
Time for a break. It's 8:47.
LBC. Leading Britain's conversation. Iain Dale. Tweet at LBC.
Let's talk about the dog anecdote, which set me off when I was on the train to Tunbridge, or from Tunbridge, and I was reading this, and I mean, your mother gave your dog away.
Yes.
How old were you? 8, something like that?
10.
10.
So we'd got this dog. A friend of my mum's basically was breeding dogs and decided that he would give as a gift to my mum and me this golden cocker spaniel puppy, which my mum decided to call Mishka, which I thought was a stupid name for a dog. But nonetheless, I was very delighted to have this lovely little puppy, and you know, as people do with their pets, we formed a very close bond. Despite my flat not being a very nice place to be, always, she made it fun and she made it home. And whenever I got home from school, she would be there waiting for me at the top of the stairs and jumping up and down. We I remember Mum brought her to school sports day and everyone loved her, although some of the kids were terrified of dogs, which was very amusing. I used to walk her everywhere. We were so close. It was like having a genuine best friend, and we formed this absolute bond of love. And then my mum fell pregnant with my first brother, and she decided basically that a dog and a baby were not a good combination, and that she would give the dog away. But at no point did she discuss this with me. So I was...
Because you would have suggested giving the baby away.
I would have said, right, don't have that fry up this time. No, that's a terrible thing. My poor brother. I love you, really. I'm not giving you away for the dog. But I don't blame my brother anyway. I blame my mother for this. But yeah, so I was asleep and I heard this noise outside the bedroom door. And I went to investigate what was going on, and it was like walking in on the scene of a crime. I saw these guys with Mishka's lead and basket, and they were very startled. My mum was very startled to see me, and I basically realised that she was giving my dog away, and I was just absolutely heartbroken and outraged simultaneously, and just was in floods of tears. So I basically decided I couldn't bear it. So I went back to bed and was just slammed the door and was sort of crying. And my mum sort of tried to console me, wasn't having any of it. But the worst thing was when we got Mishka, I spent some of my pocket money my granddad gave me on this little squeaky toy shaped like a cake. And just before she left, she came in. I was crying in bed, and she sort of came in with this little cake, and she leapt up onto the bed and she dropped the cake by my pillow. And I just think that was her way of saying goodbye, and she knew what was going on. And it's the worst. It's just one of the worst things that's ever happened to me. I think only surpassed by the death of my grandparents. That was my first experience of bereavement. Because although Mishka didn't die, and Mum said she went to a good home, that was an awful thing to happen.
Let's hear from Russ in Rugeley. Russ, what would you like to ask Wes?
Well, good evening, guys. Thanks for taking my call, Ian, and welcome back after your procedure. Great to have you back on the airways. Well, I hope I'm going to do myself justice with this call, because it means a lot to me to speak to Wes. It's just gone up even more up in my estimation after hearing he's a passionate dog lover. Before I come on to two impressions, or two things that Wes might encourage me to change about myself. Before I come on to that, I just want to give a bit of a backstory.
Well, we're nearly at the end of the hour, Russ, so can you be as quick as you can?
Yeah. Basically, in late February, my childhood sweetheart was diagnosed with kidney cancer. So although I've sort of been following Wes's career and his story over the last 6 months or so, he's touched a nerve with us. It's obviously a very difficult thing to be going through. I'm finding it harder than my wife, to be fair. I just found him inspiring, and the way you talk, Wes, you've touched me unlike any other politician. Bearing in mind I'm a Conservative voter, or was. I'm going to come on to how you've sort of changed, but you might actually encourage me to read a book in full for the first time in my life, because I just find books really unstimulating. I've got no problem reading. And also, I'm hovering over voting Labour for the first time in my life. And you are primarily the main part of that. I'd come to the conclusion I wasn't going to vote in the next election. I'm done with the Tories. I didn't think I was going to be able to vote Labour, but with you as Health Secretary and hearing your story, and at the moment, obviously, health and everything in the NHS means a lot to myself and my wife, and she's listening. It means a lot, and you've tapped into something with me. And I'd just like to say thanks for sharing your story, Wes. I think you're a lovely bloke. Keep it real, and keep it real in the future when you become Labour leader, because you will, you should, and don't let the political system change you too much. Keep it real, keep as you are, because you're a good guy, and I've got high hopes for you, mate, and I love your story.
All right, Russ.
Thank you very much for taking my call. I hope I've done myself justice.
So it's a lovely call, and hello to Mrs. Russ as well. Well, that's a nice one, wasn't it?
I was going to say, because I thought you were going to make me cry about my grandparents and my dog, but something Russ, the thing that set me off a bit listening to Russ, partly it's cancer stories hit me differently now because I've been through it, but also thing I found most difficult when I was going through what I was going through was the impact it had on the people around me. I think they found it much more difficult than I did. The hardest conversations with my partner and with my parents, and I thought I'm going to be fine. And so I never worried about myself, but I saw the impact it had on the sort of people around me. So, I just wanted to say to you, Russ, and obviously to your wife as well. I wish you all the best with your treatment, but also I wish you well, Russ, because I know it's a hard job you're doing. You've got trying to support her and look after yourself as well, because the NHS looked after us, but you've got to look after yourself as well. It's a hard thing for family members to go through when someone is going through cancer, and I hope your outcome is as happy and as successful as mine. But I really appreciate you ringing in, and that what you said meant so much to me. So thank you very much.
I've got to ask you a political question before we finish. I've just been told by my producer that I'm going to get shouted at if I don't. Today, the government have announced a 6.5% pay increase for public sector workers, including workers in the health service, including junior doctors. What's your reaction to that? I mean, would you, if you were Health Secretary, would you have wanted to accept the independent pay review body recommendation?
I think ideally, because we've got to rebuild confidence in these pay review bodies. I think having independent pay review bodies is a good thing in and of itself. I think it helps ministers to make evidence-based and objective decisions, and it helps to reassure people involved on the other side of the table in negotiations that their case has been taken seriously. We've been asked all week actually as the Labour Party, so would you just accept? And it's not we've been trying to be difficult or evasive on it. We want these processes to work. It's almost like wouldn't expect anyone to sort of sign a cheque before knowing what the value of the bill is. So I can understand waiting to see what the recommendation is and then making a decision. That's how we would operate. But, you want these pay review bodies to work, and I think part of that is ministers following decisions unless they've got a good reason.
And the teachers have accepted the 6.5%. They've called off their strikes. Do you think the junior doctors should do the same?
Well, I think the first thing the government's got to do now that they've accepted the offer, the pay review body recommendation, is get around the table with the junior doctors and say, and the consultants, and say, right, okay, this is the position we've reached. How do we get to the end of this dispute and move forward together? Because these strikes are really hurting the pockets of the people going on strike. Most importantly, they're hurting patients.
But that's not the answer, is it? I mean, I asked, should they accept the 6.5% and stop the strikes? Because the government have made clear this is the final offer.
Well, I would hope they would accept the offer. I think what the junior doctors are looking for is some light at the end of the tunnel and some reassurance that things will improve, having spent time talking to them myself. And I think one of the things that there are a whole range of issues that junior doctors are experiencing beyond their pay in terms of the conditions they're working in and career progression. But I would hope that today sees a breakthrough And, you know, I think the best way to achieve a breakthrough would be for the government to get them round the table tomorrow and talk and drop all this, but, you know, we won't talk to them until the strikes are off. You know, talk to any serious employer in this country in the private sector. They don't stop talking to their workers when they're out on strike. They double down talking to them, and that's what I want the government to do. Well,
I feel slightly dirty for having introduced a political question at the end of
I know, I was like pulling myself back together. Russ nearly broke me, I'm afraid.
Final thing. Somebody says here, why is Wes telling the whole book? I'll tell you what, we haven't touched the size of the book. I mean, there's so much in this book that we haven't talked about, so don't be put off buying it just because he's been talking about it for an hour. It's called One Boy, Two Bills and a Fry-Up, a memoir of growing up and getting on. It's published by Hodder. We share a publisher, and it's the remarkably cheap price of £20.
Oh, you can get it cheaper in bookshops already. Yeah, I wouldn't pay that.
It's not remaindered yet.
I'm not supposed to say that, am I?
No,
it's shot by my publisher.
Wes, thank you very much indeed. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you.
If you missed any of this, you can, of course, catch up on Global Player. Coming up in the next hour, we're going to talk about Dele Alli, the footballer. He's bravely revealed today in an interview with Gary Neville that he checked himself into rehab to kick an addiction to sleeping tablets and to confront his traumatic childhood. It really is quite an emotional interview, and he's been very honest about his own mental health and how it's affected his footballing career, because 4 years ago he was seen as one of the top 3 players in the country. Sadly, that's no longer the case. So I want to broaden this out and ask you, how has your own mental health affected your work and your career? 0345 6060 973 is the number to call on LBC.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
Leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom, the Schools Minister has been unable to tell LBC this evening how schools' existing budgets will be affected by a public sector pay rise. The government has accepted all recommendations by the independent pay review bodies. It will see teachers, doctors and police officers receive an increase of around 6%. Nick Gibb has told Tonight with Andrew Marr that teachers, subjects and teaching assistants won't be cut.
There are some real decisions being made about those central budgets. There is also the issue of underspends on existing budgets that would normally go back to the Treasury. And the combination of that means that we can properly fund schools to enable them to pay this money without it raiding their own budget.
2 17-year-old boys have been jailed for at least 34 years between them for killing a teenager in Wolverhampton. 16-year-old Ronan Kanda was attacked in a case of mistaken identity in June last year as he walked home from a friend's house. Kevin Spacey has begun his defence in his trial in London. The actor denies a series of sexual offences against 4 men between 2001 and 2013. Well, LBC's Fraser Knight has been at Southwark Crown Court for us today.
In the witness stand, he admitted he is a flirt, but said some of the claims against him are madness and don't make any sense. He denies all the charges against him and will continue to give evidence here tomorrow. Fraser Knight, LBC, Southwark Crown Court.
Lenders have reported the UK's biggest increase in mortgage defaults since 2009. A survey from the Bank of England also warns are expected to rise further in the coming months. Emily Blunt and Matt Damon are among the stars who staged a walkout from the London premiere of the film Oppenheimer this evening ahead of Hollywood's largest actors' union approving strike action. The Screen Actors Guild is joining another union representing screenwriters after pay talks with the studios and streaming services broke down. Union President Fran Drescher is furious.
We are the victims here. We are being victimized by a very greedy entity. I am shocked by the way the people that we have been in business with are treating us.
In the city, the FTSE 100 has closed up 24 points at 74.40. The pound buys $1.30 and €1.16. LBC weather showers across Northern Ireland, southern Scotland and northwest England tonight. Heavy rain in the southwest by the early hours and a low of 8 degrees. From Global's newsroom for LBC, I'm Daryl Jackson.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation with Iain Dale.
5 minutes past 9 on LBC. I want to talk about the footballer Dele Alli, or actually I want to talk about mental health, but this gives me the opportunity to do so because Dele Alli, who was a fantastic player for Tottenham, a fantastic player for England, and then his career went downhill and nobody could really understand why. I think there was always the thought, well, there must be something behind this, but nobody could really put their finger on it. Well, today he's given an interview to the footballer Gary Neville on his podcast, The Overlap, which is a brilliant podcast, by the way, and you can find it on Global Player. He's revealed that he checked himself into rehab this summer to kick an addiction to sleeping tablets and confront his traumatic childhood. Now, in this interview, he's spoken openly about his difficulties over the last few years and talked about the fact that he spent weeks in rehab this summer. He's opened up on childhood trauma, how he was molested by his biological mother's friend, aged 6. He's talked about the fact he started smoking when he was 7 and dealing drugs when he was 8. Revealed he was hung off a bridge by a man from his local area as a child, and says he was betrayed by his biological parents and he's no interest in a relationship with either of them. I mean, that's quite a catalogue of things, isn't it? And clearly they've caught up with him. And he's had a fairly traumatic last few years. His form has gone off a cliff. He was transferred to Everton. That didn't work out. He went on loan to Besiktas in Turkey. He's now back at Everton. And I just hope that he can deal with this in a way where he can rediscover his form, because he was the most brilliant footballer. Let's just hear a little bit of what he had to say to Gary Neville, where he revealed that he spent some time at a rehab clinic in the US to deal with this addiction to sleeping tablets, and explain why some of the thoughts and feelings he was experiencing.
I was relying on things that were doing me harm. And yeah, I think I was waking up every day and I was winning the fight, going into training, smiling, showing that I was happy. But inside I was definitely, losing the battle. And it was time for me to change it, because when I got injured and they told me I needed surgery, I could feel the feelings I had when the cycle begins, and I didn't want it to happen anymore. So I went there for 6 weeks, and Everton were amazing about it. They supported me 100%, and I'll be grateful for them forever. I think whatever happens in the future, I think for them to be so open and honest and understanding, I think I couldn't have asked for anything more in that time when, I was probably making the biggest decision of my life. Something I was scared to do, I think. But I'm happy I'd done it, and to be honest, I couldn't have expected it to go the way it did. I think before, you hear about it, it has this whole stigma around it, and it's something people don't want to do. Going into rehab, it definitely sounds scary. But yeah, I could never have imagined how much I'd get from it and how much it would help me mentally, because I was in a bad place. I think, a lot happened when I was younger that I could never understand, I could never figure out, and I was doing stupid things that I blame myself for. But really going there and learning about it, it was never really in my control. Understanding it and learning, and it's helped me a lot with other things, to do with my my blood family. I let go of some things and some bad feelings I was holding, and that would slow me down and hold me back.
That was Dele Alli, the Everton and former England footballer, speaking to Gary Neville on his podcast, The Overlap. There's two questions. The main question that I want you to answer in this hour is, well, we can all see how Dele Alli's mental health affected his work, if you can call playing football work, but that's his career. How has your mental health affected your career? And a question that I've just thought of as well. Clearly, he feels that he made the most important decision of his life, going into rehab. Have you done that? And what happened? Did it work for you? Now, for more on this connection between our mental health and the work we do, I spoke to Professor Sir Carrie Cooper, who's one of Britain's top experts on the link between those things. He's a professor of organisational psychology and health at the University of Manchester. And Carrie says Dele Alli's comments are a sign that stigmas surrounding mental health are thankfully disappearing.
I think it's really important that somebody like him comes out and says that. By the way, That's been happening for the last decade now. We're getting more and more senior people. We had the chief executive of Lloyd's Bank about 8-10 years ago come out and say he was suffering from depression in public, and he had to take some time off, and that had an impact. Listen, I mean, Ian, if you look at the figures, the largest cause of long-term sickness absence in the UK, between 50 and 60% of all long-term sickness absence is due to what we call the common mental disorders of anxiety, depression, and stress. It is the leading cause, and not just in the UK. It's in every developed country. So it is more of a prominent health-related issue than cancer and any other of those, and heart disease. It's still, in terms of long-term sickness absence, mental health is the biggie, and it really is a problem area. And the more we get people talking about it, because that's the issue, many people keep it buried. And the consequence of that, ultimately, they burn out and they need treatment. If we get it early enough, early identification, then we can actually deal with it and people can stay in employment. Employers know that now, and they've been working over the last 10 years to do something about it.
But I wonder how many employers really do know what to do about it, and whether they can convince their employees that they're not going to be marked down in their end-of-year appraisals if they're honest about their mental health.
It's changing, Ian, really dramatically changing. About 6 years ago, a number of chief medical officers and HR directors came to see me at Manchester Business School, where I work, and said, "Kerry, I want you to form the National Forum for Health and Wellbeing at Work." These are very senior people, what they call C-suite people, near board. They talk to CEOs all the time. And we started that 6 years ago. It's totally voluntary. We have 50 companies now, and big organizations, including the NHS executive, et cetera, involved in this. And they are people at very high levels who can change policy and practice. I think they're concerned about it for several reasons. Number one, it's the leading cause of long-term sickness absence. Number two, they're burning people out and losing them as a consequence, or these people are staying in the workplace, hiding it because they're frightened of talking about mental health and not performing well. It's adversely affecting their performance. So we need to do this. I mean, our productivity per capita as a country is very poor. We're 7th in the G7 on productivity per capita, and we're 17th in the G20. And this is one of the reasons, because we don't have enough people. People are burning out because of the mental stresses and strains of work, the long hours, the job insecurity, the way they're managed in particular. And we have to tackle these kinds of problems. And I think the UK is good in this, Ian. We're getting good at it now.
But of
we're
course,
really trying to deal with it.
That wasn't the case for Dele Alli, who has, I think, over a period of years, has built up a lot of different issues that have all come together and effectively caused him to break down. I mean, he's talked in this interview about the fact that he was sexually molested at the age of 6, that he started smoking at 8, he was dealing drugs at 8. And I think all of that has come together to effectively ruin his work in some ways.
Absolutely.
Now he's recognised that and he's done something about it. He could have maybe done that a bit earlier if he'd been given the right encouragement to do so.
Yeah.
If we have people listening to this programme now who they know that they've got things building up in their mind that are causing them anguish, anxiety, depression, yet they get up in the morning, don't want to go to work, they go to work, put on a brave face because they feel they need to hide it.
Yes.
What do you say to somebody in that position?
Okay, here's what I'd say is it depends on what organization you're in, because we have, the people who join my national forum who are involved in it are companies they're usually bigger organizations, big public sector bodies, big private sector companies. But remember, the majority of people are employed in what we call the SME sector, small and medium-sized enterprises. For the individual, I'd say the following. Go see HR or occupational health if you're lucky enough to have it, and talk to them about these issues early. Many companies are now doing something called EAPs, Employee Assistance Programs. They are counseling services provided to employees confidentially. So telephone numbers are given to employees to say, if you have any problems, Any personal problems, go to this number, call them up, and make an appointment. You can do it online. You can talk to them over the phone. You can go see them face to face. And that is happening. That's been happening for more than 15 years now. And the provision of these counseling services are now available. But I would say to that individual, talk about it, because HR knows that this is a problem. Occupational health knows this is a problem, but they can't deal with you as an individual unless you're prepared to open up about it. It is no longer a four-letter word, Ian, being stressed or being unable to cope. 10 years ago, 12 years ago, it was. There was a big stigma talking about, I'm not able to cope. It is no longer a stigma because it is so widespread.
So what do you think employers could do that they're not doing at the moment? I mean, is there a role for government here? I mean, we tend to think government has to have a solution for everything, but I wonder whether it does here, whether it can provide incentives, in a way, encouragement for employers to take this issue more seriously.
Where I think the government should come in is not necessarily with the big organizations, by the way, because they have big HR departments, they have big occupational health, and this is public sector bodies like government departments, local authorities, hospitals.